Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to present you today my research that I've done for PhD. And today's presentation is called Exploring the What Ifs, How Readers Perceive and Engage with Counterfactuals in Literature.
Oh. Okay, I think I need to do this. Okay, and Ksenia is coming. Good.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to introduce that it was the part of ELITE project, which is Empirical Study of Literature Innovative Training Network. This project was funded by the European Union Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program under the Marie Skłodowska-Curie grant. So the main purpose of the ELITE project was to make theory-driven approaches together with methodological approaches to investigate the literature. And the disciplines, so the fields that it included was literary theory, cognitive, neuropsychology, and education. And there were like 10 universities that we collaborated in Europe to perform this project. And we had 4 working packages, one, cognitive processes underlying literary reading, then narrative empathy during literary reading, effects of literary reading on well-being, and we had lots of trainings to develop our transferable skills. And I mainly worked on the work package 1, cognitive processes underlying literary reading. And the goals of the ELITE project was to bring social and economic benefits, including increase of literacy, reading promotion, and improve mental health, well-being, also critical thinking and tolerance. So this is the main project. To understand you that it was highly interdisciplinary research, so I combined different approaches. Okay. So my supervisors, I had 2 supervisors because I did double doctorate. So one PhD in linguistics at the University of Warsaw that you can see on the top right corner. My supervisor was Professor Monika Pożyczka, professor at the Faculty of Applied Linguistics. And my second supervisor, Professor Massimo Salgaro from the University of Verona. The pictures that you can see on the not top but bottom. So, okay, next.
I will do it for you.
Don't forget to include pictures of Slovak Academy of Sciences. Yeah, like in the future.
No, but you could include the project of the campus. You know, it's very fancy.
Yeah. Okay, next time we'll. So during my presentation, I will cover this topic. So mainly it's the one topic, which is counterfactual. But first, I define counterfactuals, then provide you with the AM question, significance, and hypothesis of my research, and introduce a theoretical framework, which is possible world theory. Then I will talk about 4 studies that I have conducted. Cognitive engagement with embedded counterfactuals and counterfactual historical fiction, and then second language processing of literary counterfactuals, and first language interference during second language processing.
But I did something wrong. Sorry.
Okay. So this is a general outline of what I will be talking about. So first, counterfactuals as its cognitive processing based on its form and semantics. Then how they are perceived using perceived realism and aesthetic feelings. Then what kind of effects counterfactuals have on readers. Political evaluation, fascism receptivity, and superstition. So what is counterfactual? I suppose every one of you have already had counterfactual thoughts. For example, if I had chosen a different profession, what I have reached in my life, or what if I have not drinking coffee today, or yes, or if only I had a second chance to change something in my past. So these are all the questions that are relevant for a counterfactual thinking when we engage in possible scenarios that could have been. Okay. So counterfactuals can be used as a literary device in literature, and I will be talking about two levels. At the micro level, counterfactuals can be disnarrated or embedded counterfactuals when they are introduced as thoughts, wishes, hopes, and dreams of characters. And then at the macro level, I will talk about counterfactual historical fiction, so counterfactual as a genre, when there is an alternative reality created contradicting the past histories that we have. So the first one, at the micro level, it is known as disnarrated or embedded counterfactuals. It was first introduced by Prince in 1988. He wrote that every narrative function opens an alternative, a set of possible directions, and every narrative progresses by following certain directions as opposed to others. The disnarrated or choices not made, roads not taken, possibilities not actualized, goal not reached. It involves hopes, desires, imagining and pondering, unreasonable expectations, and incorrect beliefs. So what I have already mentioned before, so characters introduce their wishes, what they would have wanted to see in the fictional world. Here I illustrate an example of disnarrated taken from Great Expectations. If I could have settled down, I said to PD, plucking up the short grass within reach. If I could have settled down and been but half as fond of the porch as I was when I was little, I know it would have been much better for me. You and I and Joe would have wanted nothing then, and Joe and I would perhaps have been partners when I was of my time, and I might even have grown up to keep company with you, and we might have sat on this very bank on a fine Sunday, quite different people. I should have been good enough for you, shouldn't I, BD? In this example, I illustrate the use of disnarrated in this literary text. So by using this counterfactual as a literary device, the main protagonist, Pip, wants to deliver his regret that he made the choice that he made in the past, and then he moved to London to become a gentleman, but he regrets about it, and he wants to make a different choice in the past and stay with his friends. So counterfactual historical fiction is also known as alternative reality or alla history when we remake our past history, making a contradictory information, contradictory history. So we create a world whose evolution following a certain event diverges from what we regard as actual history, as stated by Ryan. In the bifurcation lines that you can see on the screen, we can see that the past of this actual world history and the history depicted in the fictional world are the same, up to the point of divergence. So we select a nexus point in history which is important for everyone, and we change that event to its contradictory direction. So, for example, if we say about Second World War, then we can take the consequence of this war as Hitler winning the World War II in comparison to the actual world in which he failed. So we can say that from this point of divergence, the history of fictional world develops in a contradictory direction. And here I illustrate an example, Fatherland, written by Robert Harris, in which it is speculated what would have been if Hitler had won World War II. So counterfactual historical fictions are based on counterfactual premises. What would have happened if something else happened? For example, if Hitler had won World War II, or if the Roman Empire had survived to the present day, or if the French Revolution had not broken out. So, and many other topics. So the main research aim of my studies was to recognize the potential of counterfactual as a literary device. Second, to understand cognitive engagement with counterfactuals in literature. And the third one, to explore the second language processing of counterfactuals. So the main questions that I addressed were, what is the aesthetic function of counterfactuals in literature? Do counterfactuals foreground the narrative? How are literary counterfactuals processed? And does the first language influence second language processing when reading counterfactuals?
And what is the first and second language processing?
So first language is my native language, and second language, like English as second language. This study is significant because I identify counterfactuals as a literary device. I revised the possible world theory and proposed a new model for conceptualization of cognitive engagement with counterfactuals. I provide empirical findings on cognitive processing of counterfactuals and on understanding second language processing costs associated with counterfactuals. Hypothesis. The main overarching hypothesis is that literary counterfactuals are processed with increased cognitive costs and emotionality compared to literary non-counterfactuals in both native and second language. So I propose to see counterfactuals as a literary device because they map to an alternative reality, alternative past. Its affective component, its emotionality, and their deviation from the normative form and semantics.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
What do you mean by cognitive costs? Like cognitive load or something?
Yes, cognitive load. So now I would like to go deep into the theoretical framework. So the main theories that I was considering possible world theory. This is a theory originated in philosophy, according to which God foresee all the possible worlds our world could have looked like, and he chose like the best world for us to live in. And the possible worlds theory have lots of discussions. So the first and main important topic here is that which world is actual, whether all the worlds are actual or whether one world is actual. And the usefulness of possible world theory in literary field is that it helps to identify a fictional world as independent world with its own laws and center, so that now characters have their own dreams, wishes, and the London, for example, in fictional world is the same as London in our real world. So it gives a nice framework to consider the fictional worlds. So the first approach in the theoretical framework is known as modal realism, according to which every possible world is real. So any possible world can exist. So in universe, it is actualized. So if for us, our world is real, for any like inhabitant of another world, their world is real and they judge everything from their own world's perspective. But this approach, of course, was criticized a lot and found to be extravagant. Then we have the second approach, which is moderate realism, according to which we have only one actual world, which is our world, in which everything exists, and all the other possible worlds are just mental constructs. So it is a very rational approach that we can treat the possible worlds. So in the literary field, in my PhD research, I address the gaps in the use of this theory in the literary field. So I identified the ontological stance of possible worlds. Then I revised Ryan's recentrable possible worlds, which I will talk about later, so it will be clear. And then I interpreted Ryan's principle of minimal departure through Bartley's schemas, giving a bit more cognitive approach. And I also revised Ryan's possible worlds, including to the vocabulary reader's possible worlds and author's knowledge world. So now I will talk about each point individually.
And may I ask, Ainur, so all those authors, they're from literary theory mainly, or from which field they come from? Because we are completely, you know, a different one of those planets.
Yeah. You mean about authors?
Yeah, those authors that you cite, basically.
Yeah, it's okay, from literary field.
Okay,
yeah, it's very popular figures in literary field. So Ryan, whom I took into account, whose model I investigated, she's like the main literary person using possible world theory in literature. So here I identify the ontological stance. So what do I mean by ontological stance? So I first of all, before mentions that we have modal realism and moderate realism approach. And what Ryan said is that it is indifferent for us literary scholars to understand whether we have a definitive approach, whether we believe on modal realism or moderate realism, to consider fictional worlds. And I argued against this view, and I said that we need to have a clear ontological stance, because if we have, for example, if we believe that there is a modal realism, so every possible world exists, so we cannot have a clear representation of what is happening in the fictional world. Because based on Ryan's principle of minimal departure, we imagine everything from our actual world, and we add what is dictated from the text. For example, if someone tells like it is written there is a horse with wings or a flying horse, and we can see like the picture in the left, as you can see. So we imagine all the horse with all the properties that we know from the actual world, and we add wings. So this is the principle of minimal departure. And if we believe that there is a modal realism and every possible world exists, then if we read that there is a flying horse, we cannot know whether this flying horse has all the other properties of the actual world, because in that existing possible worlds, they might have 8 legs or horn, as you can see on the right side, a bit less from our world. And then that leads us to have a kind of indeterminism. So we never know what representation to have about the fictional world. So I was arguing about this. Then I revised Ryan's recentrable possible worlds, according to which Ryan states that when we recenter to the fictional world, we can use Lewis indexical shift, which is our actual world temporarily becomes like the fictional world. So we become immersed in the fictional world, and we forget and transport ourselves to that world. But I used deictic shift, which is a more cognitive approach when we say that when we shift to the fictional world, it's not like we metaphysically shifting, of course, but we cognitively shift our attention to the fictional world, and we become focused on this world, forgetting about the existence of the actual world. And then, so the principle of minimal departure that I talked about before, I explained it through Bartlett's schema. So Bartlett proposed schemata, which means that all our knowledges are stored in schemas. So for everything, we have a schema, like a schema for dog, or a schema for going to restaurant. So we have all the elements there. So we need to go there, pay, eat, etc. So here, I said that it is important to pay attention to the representation of the actual world in the mind of readers. So every reader can have a different representation. And the very simple example would be like if there is written that there is a dog, you can imagine 3 kinds of dog. So based on the reader and based on his or her schema. So in the revision of the possible worlds model, first you need to understand about Ryan's model, what she proposed. According to her, there are 3 universes: actual universe, which comprises our actual world and also possible worlds that humans create. And reader's knowledge world is a representation of the actual world by the reader. So everything what reader knows about the actual world. Then there is a textual universe, which is the textual actual world of the fictional world. So it is basically the fictional world in another term, textual actual world. Okay. And textual alternative possible world is all the other possibilities created in that world by the characters of the fictional world. And characters' knowledge world, it's what they know about the textual actual world. And here I also added readers' possible worlds. It's what readers create while reading the text. So they also co-create the textual universe. So they actively participate creating possible worlds. They have wishes, hopes, or characters. And then here's the referential universe, which is own textual reference world in center. And according to Ryan, it's projected to the text, and it is kind of source, but there is a bit of confusion what it really is, on what is its purpose. And in order to understand its role in this universe, I propose to include author's knowledge world, which is the representation of the actual world by the author. And I propose that author creates this referential universe as the set of all the fictional world, imagination of all the story. And then from the referential universe, we go to the textual universe and we take the sources from the referential universe. So here is a model that I'm proposing, which looks a bit scary, but it's not as complicated as it looks. So it is a conceptualization of how readers engage cognitively with embedded counterfactuals. As you can see, there are 3 universes mentioned before. In the actual universe, there is AK, author's knowledge world. Basically, authors create referential universe and project to the textual universe. RK, reader's knowledge world, or representation of the actual world by the reader using his mental facilities, so cognitive schemata. He focuses transport into the textual universe mentally, and then he perceives all that textual actual world using his own schemata. And then in that textual actual world, he can also co-create the textual universe, creating readers' possible worlds. And here you can see WNS, its textual states proposed by Echo, and then alternative textual states that I propose to include. So it's when we have counterfactuals in the story, we can say that it maps to the 2 possibilities: the textual state, which actually happened in the actual textual actual world, and then its alternative, what could have been instead of what happened. So by stating counterfactuals, we create the 2 possible worlds, and then we contrast between 2 worlds, as it can be shown by the arrows. And then after this contrasting comparison, we evaluate whether what happened is much better or worse what could have happened. And based on that, we have emotional engagement. So we can induce a feeling of regret if what happened is worse than what could have happened, or it's a feeling of relief if what happened is much better.
That's great.
And then yes, then you can see TPW, which is textual possible worlds. First, I applied the proposed model to the case study, so the Snows of Kilimanjaro by Ernest Hemingway. It's a short story of the couple who traveled to Africa, and there is accident happens. The main protagonist, Harry, scratched his knee, and gangrene has started, so he's dying. And they are waiting for the plane to arrive to save Harry. But then the short story ends with dual ending. So first ending is that plane arrives and the protagonist is saved. And the second ending is that plane doesn't arrive and he's dead. And lots of literary critics criticized this short story as Hemingway's failure because he could not keep the consistent coherence. But then I argued that it's actually Hemingway's success because he could project readers' possible world into the textual universe. So the readers wish for and hope for the main protagonist so that he's saved and the plane arrives. Yes. So here I illustrate the excerpt from the short story. So it's how it begins. So the Helen, wife of the main protagonist, expresses his regret using counterfactual. I wish you'd never come, the woman said. She was looking at him, holding the glass up and biting her lip. You never would have gotten anything like this in Paris. You always said you loved Paris. We could have stayed in Paris or gone anywhere. I'd have gone anywhere. I said I'd go any way you wanted. If you wanted to shoot, we could have gone shooting in Hungary and been comfortable. So it's using these counterfactuals, Helen is escaping the actual world and imaginatively creating alternative scenarios where like the choices that they did not make. And yes, So here I show that the counterfactuals used in the narrative. So why it's called embedded counterfactuals? Because it is embedded on the textual actual world. As you can see, this is all the alternative scenarios. So in this case, Helen constructs his counterfactuals connected with they are coming to Africa. So she imagines anywhere else, Hungary, Paris, whereas Harry, the main protagonist, imagines his big regrets, which is remorse that he stopped writing and that he could have written lots of great stories, like stories of grandson, soldier, expat, husband, and then he also regrets that he did not put iodine on the scratch on time and that put carbolic solution. And then here the most important thing is that reader also create this reader's possible world. As you can see, Harry is saved. So it is the possible world created by the reader, projected by the author to the textual universe. This can explain the dual ending of this short story. And based on the application of the model, I illustrated that the use of counterfactuals, a literary device, can enrich semantically the text, because without counterfactuals it would be meaningless. But with counterfactual, it also provides them moral lessons that without discipline and consistency, talent is nothing. So like if he could have written lots of stories being disciplined, then and this can help to deliver the moral. Then also it is emotionally charged, so it can help to deliver emotions such as regret and remorse. Then I also considered cognitive paradigms, so cognitive theories such as conceptual integration theory, mental model theory, and suppositional theory. So according to the conceptual integration theory, which is very theoretical and very hard to test, and I talked against about this theory, and I criticized that it's not applicable in the case of counterfactuals, because for conceptual integration theory to work with counterfactuals, we need to have at least two agents, like two main subjects who acts, or to have an instead of phrase in the sentence. So this is the framework itself is very criticized, including by Gibbs. And it's more appropriate to analyze metaphors rather than counterfactuals. Then I talked about mental model theory, which is a bit more similar to the proposed model. So according to the mental model theory, we create these two models. So first one for what happened, and the second one for what could have happened. And then the comprehension of counterfactuals is an essence of creation of these two models. Then I also consider suppositional theory, according to which we only create what could have happened from the counterfactuals, the same way as from just indicative conditionals. But I will not go into that too much. So the first empirical study, the aim of this study was to empirical test the feasibility of the proposed model on cognitive engagement with literary counterfactuals. And I addressed three main questions. First, do readers envisage the textual actual world state and its alternative state while processing literary counterfactuals? Is the textual alternative state more pronounced compared to the textual actual world state? And are counterfactuals perceived to be emotional? So the main hypothesis, which were formulated based on the proposed model, is that readers imagine both the textual actual world state and the textual alternative state while processing literary counterfactuals. Second, readers focus more on the textual alternative state compared to the textual actual world state while processing literary counterfactuals. And the last one, reading of literary counterfactuals is perceived to be more emotional rather than reading of literary non-counterfactuals. So the first study was within subjects. Overall, 40 subjects participated. Each received 20 euros for participation, funded by Elite. Then it was an eye tracking study, so I used visual world paradigm. I will explain later how it looks like. And then also comprehension test. So the idea is that where we look at, our attention also focuses. So eye and brain is interconnected. So it's how two kinds of sentences that I use. For example, first one is counterfactual. If he had come to garden court, he would have seen Madame Merle. And it's non-counterfactual version. If he came to garden court, he saw Madame Merle. So this is how visual world paradigm looks like. So first they see the dot on the screen to fixate their gaze into the center of the screen. Then they see for 5 seconds the input, so stimulus with 4 phrases. Here, not coming and not seeing would match with the real, so the actual state, what happened in the narrative. Coming and seeing would match with alternative. Then there are 2 distractors, cooking and eating, not cooking and eating. So this they say for 5 seconds, then they hear actual sentence. If he had come to garden court, he would have seen Madame Merle. And then after that, they also see this for 4 seconds. And the eye gaze was recorded for while they were listening to the sentence. So during that, I recorded the eye gaze to 4 areas of interest. So this divided into 4. Here you can see that for literary counterfactuals, they had more fixation count for affirmative modal and also for negative modal. Whereas for literary non-counterfactuals, they had more for affirmative modal. And they did not think about negative modal, and it was statistically significant. And then by items, it was repeated. So for literary counterfactuals, they looked more for affirmative modal and negative modal, but more to the affirmative modal compared to the negative modal. And the comprehension was very high for both of the groups. And the perceived emotionality was higher for literary counterfactuals rather than for literary non-counterfactuals. Then it was concluded that literary counterfactuals activate the negative modal compared to the literary non-counterfactuals. Then when participants engage with literary counterfactuals, they think about both textual actual world state and textual alternative state. And in comparison to literary non-counterfactual, where they think only about the suppositional meaning. Then when participants heard, so they thought about suppositional meaning, so it was a conclusion. Now we go back to the theoretical framework and more the application of the model to the counterfactual historical fiction. So the cognitive engagement is very similar with embedded counterfactuals with some differences. So the difference is that when we read the fictional like text, literary text, then we need to have make-believe. So it's taking the principles and laws of the fictional world as temporally true when we read the text to immerse to the fictional world. And therefore, we contrast between the representation of the actual world with the textual actual world at the moment of setting up the fictional world, so at the beginning. But then throughout the reading, we go more with the rules and what is dictated by the text and disregarding the actual world. And only recalling the schemas that are necessary to the comprehension of the textual actual world. So here, the fictional recentering is important. And after the initial contrast, we also evaluate whether our world is better or worse than the textual actual world. And as a result, we also can have emotion of disappointment if we think that our world is worse than the fictional world, or we can have an emotion of relief if we think that our world is much better. And then also important thing is that now when we understand the textual actual world, we can create one. So it's like the whole model of this textual actual world in our mind, which is based on through the lens of how we perceive the world. And then this creation of the textual actual world and its comparison with the actual world can help us to evaluate our world, so we can prospectively change our attitude to some ideologies or some beliefs that we already have about the actual world.
I think you need to click.
Okay.
I will do it.
Okay.
Okay,
so the case study was Fatherland by Robert Harris. Have anyone read this story? No. So it's a counterfactual historical fiction. It's about if Hitler had won World War II. So he, in this fictional world, he won the Second World War, and now he's celebrating 100th year birthday. And there is a dictatorship across Europe spread, and propaganda, control over people, no freedom. And this is a historical background that is described in Fatherland. And the plot for us now is less important. So we'll focus on the counterfactual historical side of the story. So here, the reader, and I'm always talking about the model reader here in the contextual framework, conceptual framework. So the model reader creates the textual actual world in which Nazi won the Second World War and contrasts it with the representation of the actual world. As a result of which, he or she might, so the model reader might change his view to the actual world. He might be more satisfied with the current political state, because it's much better than what is.
I think we all should read it now, right?
Yeah. So the aim of the second study was to examine the cognitive processing of counterfactual historical fiction, to test whether reading fiction impacts their perception of the actual world. And based on these objectives, the questions were formulated. So how do readers cognitively process the counterfactual historical fiction? Does reading fiction lead to the reevaluation of the reader's knowledge world? And does reading fiction improve cognitive skills? And is there a difference between counterfactual historical fiction and historical fiction in their effect on the reevaluation of the reader's knowledge world? Hypotheses were 7. So first, readers perceive counterfactual historical fiction as less real in factuality, but the same in plausibility in comparison with historical fiction. Here, factuality refers to the realness based on facts, and plausibility, the plot described in the story. Then the second one, people perceive counterfactual historical fiction as more surprising compared to historical fiction. And then the processing of counterfactual historical fiction is associated with more cognitive load compared to the processing of historical fiction. Reading fiction about the Nazis reduces fascism receptivity. Reading fiction lowers reader superstition. And reading fiction about the Nazis increases satisfaction with the present politics.
Ainur, may I ask you to explain one more time what's the difference between counterfactual historical fiction and historical fiction?
Okay, great question. So counterfactual historical fiction is when we contradict some historical event and we make up the story based on that contradiction. So for example, if we think that Hitler won the Second World War, which contradicts the reality.
That's clear.
Yeah. And then historical fiction, when it is based on the real history. So we do not contradict the historical facts, but
so
we just come up with some story on the background of real history that we had. So
but you always have to think about details that are not based on facts.
Yes.
So you have to imagine that.
Yes.
In historical fiction.
Yes. So in historical fiction, everything regarding history is real. So it's what really happened in the past. But the narrative, the story that is made up to drive the plot is fictional, but the history is historical. So it's real. So this study was conducted with my supervisor, Massimo Salgaro, at the University of Verona. And then we hypothesized that the effects of 4, 5, 6 would be more pronounced for counterfactual historical fiction rather than historical fiction, because when we create counterfactual historical fiction, it is the possible world for it is much more distant than the historical fictional world, because it is the same that we had in the actual world for historical fiction. So it was between subject design. So one group read the counterfactual version, the second read non-counterfactual version. There were 74 Italian native speakers, each received 20 euros for participation. Then eye tracking again, but here I used iLink 1000. Before I used SMI Red 500 eye tracker. Here you can see the picture from the real experiment. The participant was reading the text. She had a head mounter, and using infrared lights, it was tracked their eye gaze. Then we had questionnaires for perceived realism, aesthetic appreciation, political evaluation, fascist receptivity, and superstition. Then we also controlled for comprehension, historical knowledge, and familiarity with the text. So the experimental material included 3,248 words, and the control 3,253 words. So we manipulated only 33 words, so 1% of the text, to match it with historical fiction. So we changed the counterfactuality described in the text with the real historical fact. For example, on the inner walls are carved the names of the 3 million soldiers who fell in defense of the fatherland in the wars of 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1946. We changed 1914 to 1918 to 1866 and to 1871 to match the history. So results can be shown that there was more fixation count for counterfactuals compared to non-counterfactuals. So counterfactual historical fiction was more surprising than historical fiction. It was perceived as less real. And after reading both versions, their satisfaction with present political state increased than compared to the prior reading. And their agreement with fascism decreased after reading. And their superstitious belief also decreased after reading, which was hypothesized as improvement of the critical thinking.
Interesting.
So here you can see the whole procedure. So pre-reading, they did fascism, receptive, superstition, and political evaluation test. While reading, we looked at the eye gaze, so fixation, counter, visits, dwell time, and after reading, they performed the same test: fascism, receptive, superstition, political.
May I have a question? So how did you measure this fascism, receptivity, superstition, and political evaluation? Was that some established scale?
Yes.
So what was that?
So for fascism receptivity, there is F scale.
Like classical F scale, but which is very problematic nowadays.
Yeah, then we transformed it because because we know that it's very problematic. So we used only some scales and we tested with how it's called. So for so that it is coherent in the items in the questionnaire.
Okay.
Then for political evaluation, it was consisted of 4 questions. So it was constructed by us. And then superstition was also taken in the subscale of F scale.
Yeah, because,
So so we use 7-point Likert scale measurement when 1 they do not agree at all and 7 very much agree. So the conclusions are the following. So when they read counterfactual historical fiction, they have more cognitive load for the first linguistic cues that signals counterfactuality. Then it was found more surprising, less real, more political appreciation, less agreement with fascism, and less superstitious after reading. Now, so it was mainly the literary part that I was talking so far, and now we shift to the more in-between literature to linguistics. So when literature and linguistics meet, it is stylistics, so foregrounding, And here I illustrate a model of Arthur Jacobs' neurocognitive model of literary reading, according to which the text consists of background and foreground. So background, it is the contextual information. Then foreground, it's the literary devices, tropes that we use to defamiliarize the reader. So, and according to this model, the foregrounding has an effect on readers to slowed reading. They have longer fixations, small saccades, and high affect rating. So they have more aesthetical feelings when they have foregrounding. So they react to the foreground differently than to the background information. So based on this model, I was hypothesizing that then if we accept counterfactuals as foregrounding elements in the text, then it should lead to more aesthetical appreciation and to slowed reading. So here I quote Shklovsky that foreground is a technique of artists to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. So it is when we use literary devices, so we foreground the text, it leads to defamiliarization. So we perceive what is usual unusually, and then we can refamiliarize what we already know. So we perceive it differently. So Balint and her colleagues proposed 3 ways of viewing foregrounding. So it can be textual features or deviations. It can be perception of textual element as a deviation, experience of perceived deviation. And I consider foregrounding as the first one, textual features or deviations. Here I quote Leach, so deviations can be further classified into formal, grammatical, lexical, phonological, orthographic, semantic, referential, contextual, then also maybe a combination of these categories. And I consider counterfactuals as deviations because it has grammatical deviation. X marking here stands for an extra layer of morphology. As you can see in the example, if he had died after Dorota's arrival, she would have inherited a fortune. Here you can see that the second layer of the past tense morphology is used non-temporally, so it does not refer to the past time, but it helps us to yield the counterfactual meaning. So that's why it is grammatical deviation. It's so past tense is used not as usually used for denoting the past. Then counterfactuals also map to the alternative possible world outside of the context set, so what we don't know from the factual information, which is referential deviation. So here I illustrate that in the counterfactual historical fiction, we use points of divergence. So it can be regarded as semantic deviation. And here is an example from Fatherland, like Führer's 100th birthday, which is, of course, deviation from contextual information that we know, like victory over Russia in the spring of 43, peace with the British in 44, etc. So here you can see that the main deviation started with Operation Blue. So in the fictional world, it failed. It succeeded. In the real world, it failed. So it's historical bifurcation. So the third study's aim was to reveal the second language processing of literary counterfactuals, and whether literary counterfactuals cognitively costly to process by second language readers. I also address the questions, do L2 readers fully comprehend literary counterfactuals because of these deviations, and do L2 readers evaluate counterfactuals as difficult or undifficult? So
can I ask, did you conduct this study in English?
Yes, we study in English, yeah. So English as a second language.
Yes.
With students?
With Polish language students. So the hypothesis that second language reading of literary counterfactual conditionals associated with additional cognitive costs compared to the second language reading of literary non-counterfactual conditionals, second language readers can fully comprehend literary counterfactuals, and that second language readers might evaluate counterfactuals as difficult due to complex morphosyntactic integration. So it was between subject design. So one group read counterfactuals versus non-counterfactuals, the second group. 60 English as second language speakers, each received 100 zloty for participation. It was funded by the EDUP, Excellence Initiative Research University grant. It was eye tracking study, followed by comprehension and difficulty assessment task. Working memory capacity was controlled because it could influence the comprehension of counterfactuals as well as knowledge of English conditionals and also the level, English level skills. SMI read 500 was used. So here the illustration of the experimental material. Results show that for counterfactuals, they had more fixation time, more fixation count, and more dwell time. So fixation count is how many times the reader fixated, fixation time, how the sum of these all fixations, and dwell time also plus saccades when they move their eyes.
So the material of the study was that sentence?
Yes, yeah. So it was counterfactual conditionals. It was chosen because according to the previous research, the sentences before or after can also influence how counterfactuals process. So it was the most rational approach probably to include only counterfactuals. So as a result, shows that readers perceive it as not that difficult, so even like neutral to easy. Comprehension test was very high, so they also made more inferences for counterfactual conditions, factual inferences, something happened or did not happen, which they did not do for indicative conditionals. So the conclusions was that second language processing of literary counterfactuals is cognitively costly, shown in eye tracking parameters, and that second language readers can fully comprehend counterfactuals, but counterfactuals are not assessed as difficult. People's perceived difficulty of individual literary counterfactuals and non-counterfactuals might affect their cognitive processing. This study did not support shallow structure hypothesis, according to which readers in the second language do not rely on the morphosyntactic information when they process the sentences, but in this case it did not happen. Then it did not support the interface hypothesis, according to which people in the second language might have some difficulty in integrating pragmatics and semantics or semantics and syntax. So it could be shown with a positive correlation between fixation count responsible for morphological complexity and modus tollens inference generation.
Can I ask you, can you fully support those two claims without control group with English speakers as first language?
Yes, like I did only with second language readers, yes, but it would be better, of course, to compare, to have control group with native speakers. But it was based on the assumption that if they relied, so it is not more like quantitative difference, more like categorical difference, with them they can deduce the morphosyntactic information. If they fail to deduce morphosyntactic information, then they could not deduce a factual inference from so it was more like categorical, but of course in order to fully confirm, it was not the main point of the study, it was just in discussion. So that's a hypothesis that could be relevant to the study, but in order to fully test them, of course, as you said, we need to control for the first native speakers. Then the last study was language transfer theory, so according to which first language can influence a second language. It can have positive or negative influence. Sometimes it can cause errors in bilinguals, or sometimes it can help to promote the processing if the structure is similar to the first language. So here I show the glossary of counterfactual conditional in Polish. So in Polish, they use be, which is equivalent of would, in both antecedent and consequent. And this is syntactical parallelism that they have in Polish language, but in English they don't have it. So in order to make it as much similar to the Polish language, I did a syntactical parallelism. So I made the structure similar to the first language, adding be or would in the first part. So the aim of the study was to understand whether second language reading is influenced by the first language. So the questions that I addressed, does first language morphosyntactic representation affect literary counterfactuals processing in the second language? And is the second language morphosyntax resembling first language evaluated as grammatical? Hypothesis. So in the literature, it is not clear whether there is a definitive positive or negative influence in the second language from the first language. So it was hypothesized like null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis was that first language morphosyntactic representation does not affect L2 reading of literary counterfactual conditionals, whereas alternative hypothesis that first language morphosyntactic representation affects second language reading of literary counterfactual conditionals. Design was between subjects. So one group read first language similar counterfactuals, and the second group read first language dissimilar counterfactuals. There were 60 English as L2 speakers. So as usual, they received 130 for participation. Then the method was used eye tracking as well, and then grammaticality judgment tasks, control variables, working memory capacity, knowledge of English conditionals, and also English language skills. Here's experimental material. For example, the similar to the first language would be if you would have come to Garden Court, you would have seen Madame Merle, which is the addition would have to the structure. So the conclusion, there was no statistically significant difference between two groups. So there was no L1 effect that I saw in this experiment. So it was concluded that resemblance to first language morphosyntax does not facilitate second language processing, and that first language morphosyntactic representation does not affect second language reading of literary counterfactual conditionals. And then in the discussion section, I stated that there were previous studies who also did not find L1 transfer effect in the second language processing.
And it also supports the conclusions from previous study.
Yes, yeah. So the general, the last slide. So it's the final conclusion. So counterfactuals as a literary device enrich semantics and add emotional depth as a literary device. While comprehending embedded counterfactuals, readers imagine and contrast the textual actual world state and textual alternative world state. Readers also have emotional engagement. While comprehending counterfactual historical fiction, readers imagine and initially contrast the actual world and textual actual world. Readers perceive them surprising emotional engagement, which indicates emotional engagement, and with less perceived realism. Reading literary text about Nazi might lead to positive changes, decrease agreement with fascism, increase critical thinking, and increase satisfaction with political situation. Counterfactuals as foregrounding element lead to slow reading, as it was previously proposed by Arthur Jacobs in neurocognitive model of reading. And these elements are aesthetically appreciated, which also supports the model of Jacobs. Then second language readers are not categorically limited in processing literary counterfactuals and can fully comprehend them. So there is very minimal first language impact. And then these overall conclusions support the proposed model of conceptualization, the cognitive engagement with counterfactuals. Okay, thank you for